The moment Joel Sheridan walked through the door of the Garner boarding house in Dry Creek, Texas, on a blistering Tuesday afternoon in the summer of 1878, every head in the dining room turned, not because he was particularly loud or particularly large, but because he walked like a man who had already decided he was not going to stay. Effie Garner noticed that first. She noticed most things before other people did. It was a habit born of necessity, the kind that grows in a woman who has been running a boarding house alone since she was 22 years old, watching travelers come and go with the steady rhythm of a tide that never quite reached the shore before pulling back again. She could read a man's intentions from his boots before he ever opened his mouth, and Joel Sheridan's boots, though worn down at the heels and caked with the rust-colored dust of the Llano Estacado, moved with the particular efficiency of someone who had no plans to put them under a bed for long. He was not an unhandsome man. That was something she registered and then immediately set aside, the way you set aside a beautiful piece of china that belongs to someone else. He was somewhere in his late 20s, lean in the way that men get lean when they spend too much time riding and not enough time eating, with dark hair grown a touch too long and a jaw that looked like it had been carved from the same red limestone that framed the canyon walls east of town. His coat was the thing that struck her most strangely. It was a good coat, a dark oilskin duster, well-made and clearly expensive once, now softened with years of weather and wear, and he had not taken it off. Every other man who came through that door in July heat pulled his coat off before he even sat down. It was an instinct, as natural as breathing. But Joel Sheridan walked to her counter, set his saddlebag down beside his feet and stood there with that coat still buttoned and said, "I need a room, single, day-to-day if that suits you." "Day-to-day suits me fine," Effie said, because it was true that day-to-day tenants were good for business even if they were harder on the heart. "That will be 30 cents a night or $1.75 for the week, meals included. Breakfast at 6, supper at 7. You miss it, you miss it." "Day to day," he said again, like he needed to confirm it. She wrote his name in her ledger, Joel Sheridan. She asked him to spell it, and he did, slowly, watching the pen move across the page as if he found the act of being recorded in a book faintly suspicious. And she gave him the key to room 4, which had the best cross-ventilation of any room in the house, and a view of the cottonwood trees along the creek bed that turned silver in afternoon light. He thanked her with a nod rather than words and went upstairs, and Effie turned back to the pot of beans simmering on the stove and told herself she did not need to think about him further. She thought about him almost immediately. Dry Creek was a town of about 400 souls in 1878. Sitting at the junction of two cattle trails that had once been important and were now being slowly eclipsed by the westward crawl of the railroad. It had a church, a general store, a saloon called the Tumbleweed that served passable whiskey and excellent gossip, a blacksmith, a doctor of uncertain qualifications, and Effie Garner's boarding house, which had been built by her father and left to her when he died of a heart ailment 3 years prior. Her mother had passed when Effie was 14, and she had no siblings. What she had was the house, a talent for cooking that people came from neighboring ranches to experience, and a stubbornness that her father had always called backbone, and everyone else in town simply called remarkable. She was 25 years old, and she had, in the way of a woman who keeps herself too busy to be properly lonely, avoided thinking too carefully about the fact that she was 25 years old and alone. Joel Sheridan complicated that avoidance. He came down to supper that first evening still in his coat, and he sat at the end of the long common table where her 6 current boarders took their meals together, and he was polite in the quiet way of a man who has learned that silence is less likely to cause trouble than conversation. He answered questions when they were put to him. He was from Missouri, originally. He had been riding various trails for going on 4 years. He was a man who did occasional work. He described it as work that needs doing when ranchers need it done, which everyone at the table understood to mean he was a hired hand of flexible employment, the The kind of man who might fix fences one month and drive cattle the next and do things better left unspecified when money was short. Old Mr. Peabody, who had been living in room 2 since Effie's father's time and showed no signs of ever leaving, asked Joel if he had family somewhere. "Not anymore," Joel said, and the table went quiet the way tables do when someone has said a thing that closes a door firmly. Effie refilled his coffee cup without being asked, because it was her job and because it gave her an excuse to look at him more closely. His hands, wrapped around the cup, were capable-looking hands, scarred in the small specific ways of men who work with tools and animals and rope. There was a thin white scar along the back of his left hand that she found herself wondering about, and then stopped wondering about because it was not her business. He looked up and caught her looking, and she did not flinch away because she was not a woman who flinched. "Good beans," he said. "Thank you," she said. That was the entirety of their first real conversation. He was gone before breakfast the next morning, and she assumed he had moved on, the way day-to-day tenants often did, vanishing in the early dark like smoke. But his key was still on the hook in his room. She found that out when she went up to change the linens, and his saddlebag was still under the bed, and there was a book on the nightstand, a worn copy of something she could not make out the title of before she felt rude for looking too long. He came back at noon, smelling of horses and honest sweat, and asked if there was any chance of cold water and possibly something to eat, and she gave him both because she was not the kind of woman who let people go hungry just because it wasn't a scheduled meal time, and because she was honest enough with herself to admit this. She was glad he had come back. He stayed for 3 days, and during those 3 days a pattern emerged. He would leave early, spend his day doing whatever it was he did, and return for supper. He was consistently polite to her other boarders and to her. He helped Mr. Peabody carry a heavy trunk up the stairs without being asked. He fixed the hinge on the back door that had been catching for a month with nothing more than a penknife and a strip of leather from his saddle kit, and when she thanked him for it, he looked faintly embarrassed, like kindness was something he had not expected to be noticed. And he never took off his coat. On the 3rd evening after supper, when the other boarders had retired and the kitchen was quiet, Effie was washing dishes and Joel was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee. He had taken to staying a little after supper, not intrusively, just sitting quietly in the way of a man who did not particularly want to be alone in a small room, and she heard herself ask the question before she had quite decided to ask it. "Why do you keep your coat on?" The question landed in the quiet kitchen like a stone dropped in still water. She felt the ripples of it and kept washing the dish in her hands, not looking at him, giving him the dignity of being able to answer without being watched. There was a long pause, long enough that she thought he might not answer at all. "I have not found a place worth settling," he said. She set the dish down in the rack and turned around then because that answer required looking at a person. He was watching her steadily with the expression of a man who has said something true and is waiting to see what truth costs him. "You keep it on," she said slowly, working through what he meant, "so you can leave." "So I'm ready to leave," he said. "It's not quite the same thing." "What's the difference?" "Can leave means I might. Ready to leave means I intend to." She considered that. "And in 4 years you haven't found anywhere worth taking it off." "No," he said. And then, after another pause, "Not yet." The "not yet" did something to the air in the room. She did not know quite what to do with it, so she turned back to her dishes and he finished his coffee, and neither of them said anything else of consequence that evening. But when she went asleep that night, she lay in the dark thinking about what it must be like to live inside a coat for 4 years, to eat in it and sleep in it and walk in July heat in it, to carry around the constant message of your own impermanence like armor. She thought it was one of the saddest things she had ever heard. She also thought, and she felt a little guilty about this, that it was one of the most interesting things she had ever heard. Joel had not planned to stay longer than a few days in Dry Creek. He had learned, in 4 years of drifting, not to make plans about staying anywhere, because plans had a way of turning into expectations, and expectations had a way of turning into anchors, and he had decided 4 years ago that he was not ready to be anchored anywhere. The reasons for that decision were complicated and lived in a part of his chest he did not examine too carefully. He had come through this part of Texas, following a tip from another rider he had met in Abilene, Kansas. A quiet man named Hatch who had mentioned that the ranches around Dry Creek were paying fair wages for fence work, and that there was a woman running a boarding house there who set the best table in 100 miles. Both of those things had turned out to be true, and he had found work easily with a cattle rancher named Beaumont Stokes, who ran a mid-sized operation about 6 miles east of town and was in the process of extending his fence line. The work was honest and physical, and it required nothing of him except his labor, which was fine. Joel had become expert in 4 years at work that required nothing except his labor. But then there was Effie Garner and her kitchen. He had not expected her. He had expected a boarding house. He had stayed in dozens of boarding houses, and he had not expected that one of them would be run by a woman with dark gold hair pinned up in a slightly impractical way that suggested she had put it up efficiently rather than decoratively, with gray eyes the color of a winter sky before snow, and a manner that was direct without being cold. Most of all, he had not expected a woman who noticed everything. He was used to being invisible in the way of transient men. He ate and slept and moved on and left no mark. Effie Garner noticed him the way she noticed everything, with a calm, almost scientific attention that was nothing like being watched and everything like being seen. It was unsettling. He was not sure he liked it. He was quite sure he did not want to stop experiencing it. After her question about the coat, he found himself thinking about leaving more carefully than usual, the way you think about putting down something heavy that your arms have gotten used to carrying. He had ridden from Missouri through Kansas and into Texas over the course of 4 years, and in all that time no one had asked him that question with the particular seriousness she had asked it. People sometimes commented on the coat. It was July, after all, but it was always a joke, a teasing remark, the kind of social observation that requires nothing more than a laugh in return. Effie had not teased. She had asked and then waited for a real answer, and when he gave one she had turned it over in her mind right there in front of him, thinking about it, and the fact that she took it seriously made him want to sit with it himself. He stayed a 4th day and a 5th. On the 6th day, which was a Sunday, Dry Creek observed the Sabbath in the way of most frontier towns, nominally, with church attendance by those who felt it was necessary and no noticeable change in behavior by anyone else. Effie went to church. Joel did not, but he found himself sitting on the front porch of the boarding house when she came back down the street in a blue dress that was practical and pretty at once, carrying her Bible in one hand and a brown paper parcel in the other. "What's in the parcel?" he asked, because he was a man who was bad at small talk and fell back on direct questions. "Ginger cake from Mrs. Aldrich," she said. "She brings one every Sunday, and I never have the heart to tell her I cannot abide ginger." She stopped at the porch steps and looked up at him. "Do you like ginger cake?" "I don't know that I've had strong opinions about it," he said. "Then you can have this one and spare me the performance of pretending to enjoy it," she said, and held out the parcel, and he took it, and she came up the steps and sat in the other porch chair, and they sat there in the Sunday morning quiet for a while, him eating the cake in pieces torn with his fingers and her watching the cottonwoods down the road move in the hot summer air. "Do you have a church you were raised in?" she asked. "Methodist," he said. "My mother was Methodist. My father was of the opinion that God was too busy for most people. What do you think?" He considered it, breaking off another piece of cake. "I think some people need a building to feel close to something larger than themselves. I don't think I'm one of them. Where do you feel close to something larger than yourself?" He looked at the horizon, at the long, flat sweep of the country south of town, golden brown under the summer light. "Out there mostly, on the trail. When it's very early and very quiet, and the sky goes from black to purple to this particular shade of blue that doesn't have a name. It feels close to something then. She was looking at him when he turned back from the horizon. She had that expression again, the one that was not pity and not judgment and was something more like careful attention. "You're not as difficult to talk to as you appear," she said. "What do I appear to be?" "Sealed shut," she said, "like a letter that wasn't meant to be opened." He laughed. It surprised him, it surprised both of them, from the way her expression shifted into something warmer. He could not remember the last time he had laughed at something and meant it. "I've been told that before," he said. "Who told you?" "My brother," he said, and the lightness left him as quickly as it had come, because the word brother opened the door to a room he kept closed, and he could feel the cold air of it moving. Effie seemed to sense the change. She did not press. She looked back at the cottonwoods and said, "This cake really is dreadful." "It's not wonderful," he agreed, and the moment passed, and something quietly and without ceremony began between them that neither one of them had a word for yet. The weeks moved the way summer weeks in Texas move, heavy and slow in the heat of the day, briefly merciful in the early mornings and late evenings when the air cooled enough to remind you that the world was not entirely made of dust and heat. Joel extended his stay at the boarding house on a weekly basis now, and Beaumont Stokes had given him enough fence work to last through September at least. He was earning money and saving most of it, which was also a habit. What he was saving toward, he could not have said clearly. He and Effie fell into a rhythm, the way people do when they share a domestic space and are both too practical to pretend they haven't noticed each other. He helped where help was useful, carrying water, splitting firewood in the yard behind the house, once repairing a section of the porch railing that had rotted through. She did not ask him to do these things. He simply did them, and she thanked him without making too much of it, which was the right response, the one that did not make him feel either used or over-rewarded. Their real conversations happened in the evenings after supper in the kitchen. The other boarders varied. Mr. Peabody was the constant, and there was a schoolteacher named Miss Dunmore who came and went on a term-time schedule, and various traveling men and ranchers' wives, and one memorable week, a patent medicine salesman named Hawthorne who talked incessantly about the curative properties of his particular elixir, until Effie, with perfect courtesy, suggested he might be more comfortable at the tumbleweed. And he left the next morning, but the after-supper coffee in the kitchen was something that became, quietly and without announcement, a thing that was specifically theirs. He told her, in pieces over many evenings, the shape of his life. He had grown up outside of Springfield, Missouri, the second of 3 boys born to a farmer who loved his land and a mother who loved her sons with the particular fierce tenderness of a woman who knows the world is hard. His eldest brother, Thomas, had been killed in a dispute over land rights with a neighboring family when Joel was 23. A stupid, terrible, pointless death that had left a wound in the Sheridan family that never quite healed over. His younger brother, Daniel, had married a woman from St. Louis and moved east toward a life that did not include Missouri dirt or memories of Thomas. His mother and father had grown old with grief in a way that was painful to watch, and Joel, who had never quite known what to do with his own grief, had eventually saddled his horse and ridden west, telling himself it was temporary, and finding that temporary had a way of extending itself indefinitely when you had no particular reason to stop. Effie listened to all of this over the course of several evenings, never pressing for more than he offered, storing what he told her carefully the way she stored preserved goods for later, for need, with respect for the thing itself. She told him, in return, about her own life, though she tended to tell it more practically than he did, as if the emotional content of events was something to be noted and then set aside in favor of the facts. Her mother's death when Effie was 14, years of running the household while her father tried to keep the boarding house afloat, the way she had taken on the full weight of it after his death with a matter-of-factness that she described as simply what had to be done and that Joel found, the more he understood it, quietly heroic. She had been briefly engaged at 20 to a man named Edward Calloway, who had decided the prospect of marrying a woman who owned a boarding house was less appealing than the prospect of the California gold fields, which by 1875 were largely played out, and who had ridden off with a confidence that Joel found, from Effie's description, rather irritating. "Were you heartbroken?" he asked her one evening, not sure why he needed to know. She thought about it seriously, the way she thought about all serious things. "I was more insulted than heartbroken," she said. "I think I had known for some time that Edward loved the idea of me better than he loved me. The idea of me was more convenient." "What's the idea of you?" She looked at him levelly. "A woman who manages things, who keeps a house and cooks and is steady. Men like the idea of that. The reality of it is that I have opinions and I don't always agree with people, and I find certain types of foolishness genuinely difficult to tolerate." "I've noticed," he said, and it came out warmer than he intended, like an admission. She looked at him with those steady gray eyes, and for a moment the space between them in that kitchen felt very small. And then Mr. Peabody knocked on the kitchen door to ask if there was any more coffee, and the moment dispersed, but it left something behind, a kind of atmospheric charge that did not go away. It was in August that the difficulty with Marcus Hale came to the surface. Marcus Hale was a man of some local significance in Dry Creek. He owned the general store and a significant interest in the Tumbleweed Saloon, and had arrived in the county about 2 years prior with enough capital to buy influence and the temperament to enjoy exercising it. He had been pressing Effie, in the way of a man who considers persistence a virtue regardless of the other party's preferences, to sell him the boarding house. He wanted the building for commercial purposes. He had said something about expanding his store operation, and he had been making offers with increasing frequency and decreasing patience. Effie had declined all of them. The boarding house was her father's work and her livelihood, and she had no intention of selling it, and she said so with the direct clarity that was native to her character. Marcus Hale did not receive direct clarity well. He was the kind of man who had learned that money and persistence could eventually wear down most people's resistance, and he had not yet encountered a case where it could not. Joel became aware of this situation gradually, through the normal accumulation of small observations: Hale stopping by the house, Effie's expression when she came back inside afterward, the tension she carried in her shoulders during those evenings that she otherwise kept very controlled. He did not ask about it directly at first, because it was not his business, and he was aware that Effie was entirely capable of handling her own affairs. But one afternoon in late August, he was returning from Beaumont Stokes's place on horseback, and came through town just as Hale was outside the boarding house again, standing too close to Effie on the porch in a way that was not quite threatening, but was designed to make itself felt, and Joel's horse slowed to a walk without him consciously deciding to slow it. He came up to the porch and dismounted and said, "Everything all right, Miss Garner?" Hale looked at him with the assessing expression of a man who is calculating whether another man is worth his time. Joel looked back at him with the flat patience of a man who has spent 4 years on trails where the question of who is worth whose time had a different weight than it did in towns. "Fine," Effie said, and her voice was steady, but her eyes said thank you. Hale left shortly after, and Joel tied his horse at the post and came up to the porch, and Effie sat down in her usual chair with the slight deflation of someone releasing a held breath. "How long has he been making trouble?" Joel asked. "He is not precisely making trouble," she said. "He makes offers. He is persistent about the offers. It is not a crime to make offers." "How does he make you feel when he makes them?" She was quiet for a moment. "Like he is waiting for me to get tired," she said. "Like he thinks this is a matter of endurance and he is confident his endurance is greater than mine." "Is it?" She looked at him with something sharp and clear in her eyes. "No, I didn't think so," he said. But the situation with Hale was not going to resolve itself through Effie's stubbornness alone, as it turned out. In early September, there were 2 incidents that shifted things. The first was a rumor. started by unknown means and circulated through the tumbleweed, that the Garner boarding house had problems with its water supply, a vague and damaging suggestion that had the effect, over the course of about a week, of causing two of Effie's regular boarders to seek accommodations elsewhere. In a business run on narrow margins, the loss of two boarders was significant, and Effie knew and Joel knew, and most of the town suspected that the rumor had not arisen by accident. The second incident was more direct. A man named Lester Cray, who was employed by Hale in various informal capacities that the town mostly did not ask about too carefully, stopped Joel on his way back from the livery stable one evening and told him, in the friendly and menacing way of a man delivering a message from someone else, that Hale would consider it a personal favor if Mr. Sheridan found his accommodations elsewhere, and that the boarding house was going to be changing ownership soon regardless, and that it would be more comfortable for everyone if Joel was not around when it did. Joel looked at Lester Cray with the same flat patience he had directed at Hale himself and said, "I appreciate you telling me. I'll give it the consideration it deserves," and walked back to the boarding house and went inside and knocked on the kitchen door, where Effie was finishing her evening work. He told her what Cray had said, watching her face as he told it. She took it in without flinching, but her jaw tightened in the way it did when she was containing something. "He is trying to isolate the house," she said. "Remove the boarders, remove anyone who might be considered an ally, and then make another offer when I'm down enough to consider taking it." "That's what it looks like," Joel said. "I have savings," she said. "Not a great deal, but enough to sustain the house for several months without full occupancy. He can't starve me out quickly. I know you can manage this," Joel said carefully, "but I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere because Lester Cray suggests I should." She looked at him for a long moment. Something shifted in her expression, not the clinical observation he had grown used to, but something more open, more exposed, like a window unlocked from the inside. "Why?" she asked, and the question was simple and genuine and asked for a real answer. He thought about telling her it was the principle of the thing. He thought about saying something about not letting men like Hale win. Both things were true. But neither of them was the whole truth, and she was the kind of woman who deserved the whole truth. "Because this is the first place in 4 years that I've had any difficulty imagining leaving," he said. The kitchen was very quiet. The evening light came through the window and made the room golden. Outside, somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and then went silent. Effie set down the dish towel she had been holding and looked at him with those clear gray eyes, and he watched her take his words in and consider them with the same careful seriousness she brought to everything, and he felt the peculiar and unprecedented vulnerability of having said a true thing to someone who was actually listening. "That is the most you have ever told me," she said. "I know," he said. She picked up the dish towel again and turned back to the counter, but the line of her shoulders was different than it had been before, and when she said good night to him 20 minutes later, there was something in her voice that was warm in a way that made him lie awake in room 4 for a long time, staring at the ceiling with the sounds of the sleeping house around him. He did not take his coat off that night when he came upstairs. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the coat as if seeing it clearly for the first time in a while, thinking about the first night he had put it on and not taken it off, which had been the night after Thomas's funeral, when he had packed a bag and saddled his horse and ridden away from everything that hurt him. The coat had become a kind of statement he made to the world and to himself. "I am not here to stay. I reserve the right to go. Don't expect me to put down roots in your particular piece of ground." It had been, he admitted to himself in the dark, the loneliest 4 years of his life. He fell asleep with his coat on and dreamed about nothing, which was better than dreaming about Thomas. The matter of Marcus Hale came to a head in mid-September, and it came from a direction that neither Effie nor Joel had fully anticipated. Hale, apparently deciding that subtle pressure was taking too long, attempted to leverage the water rights issue legally. There was a claim, he told the town, that the boarding house had been drawing from a well that was technically on a parcel he had recently purchased, and that Miss Garner owed back payments for the use of the water, and that until those payments were settled, he had the right to restrict access. It was, as the town's lawyer, a mild and myopic man named Mr. Turnbull, who mainly handled property disputes and wills, explained to Effie, not entirely without legal standing, depending on the survey lines of the original land grant, which had not been properly recorded. Effie sat across from Turnbull in his small hot office with her hands flat on the table and listened to all of this and then said, "How do I settle this?" Turnbull adjusted his spectacles and said it was a matter of the land survey, and that to contest Hale's claim, they would need to locate the original survey documents, which might be in the county record's office in Millard's Crossing, the county seat, about a day's ride east. Joel drove Effie to Millard's Crossing in the boarding house wagon, with a horse borrowed from Beaumont Stokes to supplement her own, and they made the trip in a single long day with the August sun hammering down on the flat country between towns. It was the first extended time they had spent alone together outside of the boarding house, and something about the openness of the country and the shared purpose of the journey made conversation come differently between them, freer, less bounded by the habits of the kitchen. She told him about her father, more than she had before, the way he had built the boarding house himself, board by board, in the summer of 1865, coming to Texas after the war with almost nothing and the stubborn conviction that he could make something from a thing that needed doing. He had loved the house not as a building, but as proof of a proposition about what a person could do with determination. She had grown up knowing that lesson without ever having to be taught it explicitly. "That's why you won't sell," Joel said. "It was not a question. He built it with his hands," she said simply. "There are places in that house I can still see his work in. The way the window frames sit, the particular pitch of the roof. I cannot sell that to Marcus Hale so he can turn it into a dry goods annex." "No," Joel said. "You can't." They rode in companionable silence for a while after that, the dry grass rolling away from the road on both sides, hawks circling high and distant over the plain. "Tell me about Missouri," she said after a while. He looked at the horizon. "Green," he said. "Much greener than this. The kind of green that in dry country you start to forget is possible. Rivers that actually have water in them all year. Soil that makes things grow if you look at it right. Do you miss it?" "I miss the idea of it," he said carefully. "I'm not sure I can go back to the actual thing. The actual thing has Thomas in it, in the ground." She looked at him steadily for a moment and then looked back at the road, and the quiet she gave him then was the best kind of quiet, the kind that holds something rather than ignoring it. "I think," she said carefully after a long pause, "that you have been punishing yourself for living, since he died." He felt the truth of that hit him like cold water. No one had said it to him before, not in those words, not so clearly. He did not answer for a moment. "Maybe," he said. "You didn't die with him," she said very quietly. "You're not required to live as if you did." The country passed around them, enormous and indifferent and beautiful in the brutal specific way of West Texas in September. Joel stared at the road and felt something in his chest that he had not felt in a long time, the particular pain of something that has been numb beginning to feel again, the ache of returning circulation. "You're a very direct woman," he said, and his voice came out rougher than he intended. "I've been told that before," she said, with a ghost of a smile. "I don't find it unpleasant," he said. "Good," she said, "because it's not something I'm likely to change." They found the survey documents in the county record's office in Millard's Crossing after 2 hours of Effie working through boxes of papers with focused efficiency, while Joel spoke with the county clerk, and then, finding the clerk unhelpful, with the clerk's supervisor, who turned out to be more interested in accuracy than in Marcus Hale's local influence. The original survey showed clearly that the well on the boarding house property was within the legal boundary of the Garner lot by a margin of 12 feet, and that Hale's recently purchased parcel began well beyond it. Effie looked at the document for a long moment and then said, very quietly, "Thank God my father was precise about property lines." She had copies made, paid the recording fee, and put the documents carefully in the oilskin bag she had brought for the purpose. When they came out into the afternoon sunlight, she stood on the steps of the records building and looked up at the sky and closed her eyes briefly, and Joel, watching her, felt a wash of something he could only describe as admiration so strong it was almost painful. "He had no case," she said, opening her eyes. "He had no case," Joel confirmed. She looked at him then, and there it was again, that open, unlocked thing in her expression. "Thank you," she said, "for driving, for coming." "I told you I wasn't going anywhere," he said. They ate supper in Millard's Crossing at the only restaurant in town, a clean establishment called Beaumont's Table that had nothing to do with Beaumont Stokes, and served excellent beef stew. And they sat across from each other in the lamplight, and talked for 2 hours without running out of things to say, which was something that could not be said of every dinner Joel had eaten in 4 years of eating mostly alone or with strangers. He found himself studying her face across the table, the line of her jaw, the way her eyes changed when she was thinking hard about something versus when she was simply present, the almost imperceptible dimple that appeared when she found something genuinely funny. She caught him looking and did not look away. "What are you thinking?" she asked. He was not a man who said the true thing easily. He had spent 4 years getting very good at not saying the true thing easily. But she had been direct with him on the wagon road today, and she deserved the same. "I'm thinking that you're the most thoroughly yourself person I've met in a very long time," he said. "Maybe ever." She blinked once, the only sign that this had landed somewhere real. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means most people are partly who they are and partly who they think they should be, or who they think other people need them to be. You don't seem to have that split. You're just Effie Garner all the way through. There doesn't seem to be a gap between what you think and what you say and what you do." She was quiet for a moment. "That might simply be a lack of imagination," she said. "No," he said. "I don't think so." They drove back to Dry Creek by the last light of the day and the first stars of the night, and the air had cooled to something merciful, and the country spread out around them silver-gray and limitless, and for a stretch of several miles neither of them spoke, because silence between them had become, somewhere along the way, a comfortable thing. Joel kept his hands on the reins and was aware, with every breath, of how close she was on the wagon seat beside him. When they reached Dry Creek and the boarding house came into view, lights in the downstairs windows, the familiar shape of it against the dark sky, Joel felt something in him settle like a foundation beam seating itself properly in earth. He helped her down from the wagon and their hands held for a second longer than necessary, and she looked up at him in the dark and said, "Come have coffee before you sleep." He had the documents on the table in front of him, and she made the coffee, and Mr. Peabody had already gone to bed, and the house was quiet. They sat with the documents between them and their coffee cups and did not talk about Hale or the legal situation at all, but about small things, his horse, whose name was Calico, and who had the bad habit of biting fence posts out of apparent philosophical disagreement with fences, her garden, which she tended in the mornings before anyone was awake, the only truly private time she had in a house full of people. "Do you ever feel trapped by it?" he asked, meaning the house, the responsibility, the permanent commitment of a life built around one specific place. "Sometimes," she said honestly, "and then I feel the opposite, held rather than trapped. There's a difference. Being held is something you choose." He looked at her and she looked at him, and the kitchen was very warm and the night outside was full of the small sounds of a sleeping town, and he was aware of himself sitting here in this particular place at this particular moment with more completeness than he had felt sitting anywhere in 4 years. "Effie," he said, very quietly, and her name in his voice was different from all the other times he had said it. "Yes," she said, equally quiet. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers, and she turned her hand and held his, and they sat like that for a moment in the lamplight, and it was not dramatic or sudden. It felt more like something that had been becoming true for a long time finally becoming acknowledged. "I don't want to leave," he said. "Then don't," she said simply. He looked down at their hands. "I don't know how to stop," he said with a rawness that surprised him. "I don't know how to be somewhere. I haven't been somewhere in 4 years. I don't know if I still know how." She squeezed his hand. "You know how to split firewood," she said, "and fix hinges and drive wagons and sit in a kitchen and drink coffee. I think that's a considerable amount of knowing how." He laughed again, and she smiled, and it was the best thing that had happened to him in 4 years, bar none. He did not take his coat off that night either, not quite yet, but the decision about the coat was very close now, turning in him like a key in a lock. Effie presented the survey documents to Mr. Turnbull the following morning, and Turnbull, looking considerably relieved, wrote a letter to Marcus Hale outlining the legal position with clarity. Hale, who was many things but was not a fool, received the letter, made one final attempt to reframe the situation as a misunderstanding, and then went quiet on the subject of the boarding house with a finality that suggested he had redirected his acquisitive energy elsewhere. The rumor about the water supply died as rumors do slowly, then all at once, leaving a faint residual skepticism that Effie addressed practically by inviting anyone who wanted to see the well to come and inspect it, and several people did, and the matter was settled. The two boarders who had left during the trouble came back within 2 weeks, bringing with them a third who was new to the territory and looking for steady accommodations, and the boarding house was as full as it had been all year. Effie ran the numbers in her ledger one evening with the small private satisfaction of a woman who has come through difficulty intact. Joel had extended his stay indefinitely. He had not discussed this explicitly, but he had stopped asking for day-to-day rates and started paying by the month, which Effie recorded in her ledger and which said, in the practical language of boarding house accounting, something that neither of them had yet said aloud in plainer terms. He was still wearing his coat. This was a matter they were both aware of, that had a significance between them now that it had not had before his explanation of it. She did not bring it up again, because she understood what it meant, and she understood that it was his to decide. October came to Dry Creek on a northerly wind that said winter was coming, and with it the particular beauty of the Texas plains in fall, the light going golden and low, the cottonwoods along the creek turning their October colors, the mornings sharp and the afternoons still warm enough to be pleasant on a porch. Joel had finished his fence work for Beaumont Stokes, but had found new work at a neighboring ranch breaking horses, which he turned out to be very good at. He came home in the evening smelling of horses, an honest effort, and was unfailingly present for supper, and afterward for coffee in the kitchen with Effie. Things had shifted between them since the night he had held her hand across the table, without shifting so dramatically that either of them had to name the new configuration too quickly. There was a closeness now, expressed in small things, the way he would come and stand near her when she was working in the kitchen, not intrusively, just close. The way she would sometimes say his name in the middle of a sentence for no reason except, apparently, the pleasure of saying it. The way they had started sitting on the porch together after supper on mild evenings, watching the light go out of the sky. The other boarders had noticed, in the way that people who share a domestic space inevitably notice things, and Mr. Peabody had said, with his particular ancient dignity, that he thought Miss Garner was looking better rested than she had in some time, and had looked at Joel with transparent meaningfulness. It was on a mild October evening that Joel finally understood, with a clarity he could not avoid, what he wanted. He was sitting on the porch in the last light of the day, listening to Effie inside the house. He could hear her moving through the kitchen, humming something he could not quite make out, the small domestic sounds of a woman in her own space, and he thought about Missouri, about Thomas in the ground and Daniel Incent. Louis and his aging parents in a house full of grief, and he thought about 4 years of roads and boarding houses and the inside of his own coat, and he thought about this porch and the cottonwoods and Effie Garner's voice saying his name. He wanted to stop moving. He wanted to stop being ready to leave. The thought opened in him like a flower opening, slowly and inevitably. He wanted to be somewhere. Here. He wanted this porch and this kitchen and this woman who was direct and capable and honest, and who saw him so clearly that being seen by her did not feel like exposure but like being known. He stood up from the porch chair and went inside. She was in the kitchen, finishing the evening's last tasks, and she turned when she heard him come in and saw his face, and something in her expression became very still and very attentive. He shrugged the coat off his shoulders. It was not a dramatic gesture. He did not announce it or make a ceremony of it. He simply took it off and folded it over the back of a chair, and stood there in his shirt sleeves for the first time in 4 years, in a room that was warm from the stove and smelled of coffee and biscuits and the specific good smell of a house that is cared for. Effie looked at the coat, folded on the chair, and then looked at him. "This is a place worth settling," he said. She crossed the kitchen in 3 steps, and his arms came around her and hers around him, and they stood like that for a long, still moment that felt like the end of something, and the beginning of something, and the most completely right thing that had happened to either of them in a long time. Her forehead was against his shoulder and he could feel her breathe. And outside the kitchen window, the last of the October light was fading from orange to dark blue. He pressed a kiss to the top of her head, into her pinned-up hair, and she tipped her face up, and he kissed her properly in the warm kitchen in the house worth settling in. After a moment she pulled back just far enough to look at him, and she was smiling the real, full smile that he had only seen a few times that changed the whole architecture of her face. "I need to tell you something," he said. "Tell me." "I need to write to my parents," he said. I've been poor at writing. I should tell them where I am. They should know I'm not still riding away from things." She touched his jaw with one hand, brief and gentle. "Yes," she said, "you should." "And I need to ask you something," he said. "Ask me." But it was not the right moment for that question. He knew it as soon as he started to form it. The right moment for that question deserved more than the kitchen after supper, deserved something that was a real gesture from a man who had spent 4 years making no gestures at all. He shook his head slightly and said, "Not tonight, but soon." She studied him for a moment and then nodded, with the trust of a woman who has learned to read this particular man. "All right," she said. "Not tonight." November was the month things settled into their proper shape. Joel wrote the letter to his parents, a long letter, longer than anything he had written in years, telling them where he was and that he had found something worth staying for, and asking after them with a warmth that he had been carrying around without direction for 4 years, waiting for somewhere to put it. He wrote a shorter note to Daniel, also long postponed. He did not know what responses would come, but the act of writing felt like something being set right, a fence post being reset in its proper hole. He did not take his coat off indoors again after that first night meeting. He took it off every time he came inside, hanging it on the peg by the door the way a man hangs his coat when he lives somewhere. The coat was still the same coat, worn and good and weathered, but it had changed in function. It was now outerwear, protection against the cold, a practical garment, rather than a statement about impermanence. He had not noticed, until he stopped making the statement, how much constant weight the statement had had. On a clear, cold November evening, about 3 weeks after the kitchen moment with the coat, Joel asked Mr. Peabody in passing whether there was a jeweler in Dry Creek or whether he would need to go to Millard's Crossing. Mr. Peabody looked at him with the bright eyes of an old man who has been waiting for someone to ask a particular question, and said that there was, in fact, a jeweler, a woman named Mrs. HSU who had come to the territory with the early railroad workers and stayed on, and who did very good work with silver. Joel spent an afternoon with Mrs. HSU, who was businesslike and skilled, and who showed him several examples of her ring work with the confident efficiency of a woman who knew her craft. He chose a silver ring set with a small piece of carnelian, reddish-orange and warm, the color of the West Texas earth that had been the ground under his feet when he started being somewhere rather than everywhere. He asked Effie on a Saturday morning in mid-November, on the porch, in the clear cold light before breakfast, when the air smelled of frost and coffee, and the cottonwoods had lost most of their leaves, and the sky was the particular wide blue of West Texas in fall. He had gotten up earlier than she had, which was notable because she was always first up and made the coffee himself, and had it waiting for her when she came out onto the porch with her hair still loose and her coat buttoned against the cold, looking startled to find the coffee already made. She looked at the cup in his hand and at him and said, "You made the coffee." "I know how to make coffee," he said. "You never make the coffee," she said. "I'm making it now," he said. "Sit down, Effie." She sat, watching him with that careful attention, the morning light on her face, her loose hair over her shoulders. He sat beside her and they both had their coffee for a moment, and the town was just waking up, the first sounds of the day starting up down the street. "I wrote to my parents," he said. "I know," she said. "My mother wrote back." He had gotten the letter 2 days ago, had read it 3 times, had kept it in his breast pocket. She said she was glad I had found somewhere worth going. She said to please give her regards to anyone who had helped me remember that. He paused. She said if I had found a woman to not be a fool about it. Effie's mouth curved. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman." "She is," he said. He set down his coffee cup and turned to face her and took the ring from his pocket. "I've been carrying this for a couple of weeks now because I kept trying to think of the right thing to say. And then this morning I realized I had already said it. I said it the night I took my coat off. This is a place worth settling. You are the place worth settling. You, this house, this porch, this whole impractical town full of dust and difficult people. I want to be here, with you. I want to make it permanent." She looked at the ring in his palm and then at his face, and her gray eyes were bright in a way he had not seen before. "Joel Sheridan," she said, "you traveled 4 years and wore a coat indoors in July to get here, and I think that constitutes sufficient effort." He laughed and she laughed, and he slid the ring onto her finger and she turned it in the morning light so the carnelian caught the sun, orange-red and warm. "Is that a yes?" he said. "That is a yes," she said. He kissed her on the porch in the cold morning, and somewhere down the street, someone's rooster announced the day. And the cottonwoods stood bare and silver along the creek, and Dry Creek, Texas, went on being a small and impractical and real place in which 2 people had between them made something that was going to last. They were married in December on the 15th in the Methodist church on the east end of town, because Effie had been raised in that church, and because Joel, thinking of his Methodist mother, found it appropriate. The minister was a young man named Reverend Clark who performed the ceremony with genuine warmth and only a moderate amount of preaching. The church was full. Dry Creek was a town of 400, and a good portion of them came, because a wedding in December was the best possible distraction from the winter, and because Effie Garner was well regarded by the community she had fed and housed and served for 3 years. And because people had noticed Joel Sheridan's transformation from a man who walked through doors, ready to leave, to a man who had clearly decided to stay, and found it gratifying, the way people find any evidence of human improvement gratifying. Mr. Peabody cried. He claimed it was the cold air. Beaumont Stokes, who had come with his wife and 2 daughters, clapped Joel on the shoulder afterward with the particular approval of a man who values steadiness and recognizes it when it arrives. Mrs. HSU came and admired her own work on Effie's ring with professional satisfaction. The celebration after the ceremony was at the boarding house. Effie had insisted on this because it was her house, and she knew better than anyone how to feed a crowd, and because the idea of celebrating anywhere else felt wrong, and there was more food than anyone could reasonably consume, and 3 fiddle players from one of the neighboring ranches who played until midnight, and people danced on the cleared floor of the common room, and the boarding house, which had been built by a man with determination and run by a woman with backbone, was full of music and warmth and the particular kind of happiness that comes from a thing being right. Joel danced badly and did not care. Effie danced well and made allowances for his deficiencies with the practical grace that was characteristic of her. Late in the evening, when the guests had begun to thin and the fiddle players had slowed to something quieter, he held her on the floor of her own dining room and said into her hair, "This is the best evening I've had in a very long time." "Since when?" she said. He thought about it honestly. "Since before Thomas died," he said. She tightened her arms around him briefly, and they swayed in the lamplight, and outside the December night was cold and clear and full of stars. The winter was the first he had spent indoors and at rest in 4 years, and it was different from what he had expected. He had expected, on some level, the restlessness, had expected the walls to feel like constraint and the routine to feel like a cage. He found instead that rest, after 4 years of constant motion, was something he had forgotten how to do and was relearning with the particular pleasure of rediscovery. He had forgotten what it was like to wake up in the same bed more than a few nights in a row. He had forgotten what it was like to have a reason to come home. He came home every evening now, in the full sense of the word. He helped with the boarding house in the mornings before leaving for work, carrying water, doing the tasks that required heavy lifting, the ongoing small repairs that a house of that age and constant use required. Effie had hired a part-time girl named Clara to help with the laundry, which was one of the physically demanding tasks she had been doing entirely alone. And Joel had suggested this, and Effie had agreed, and Clara turned out to be efficient and cheerful, and everything worked better. In January, a letter came from Daniel, Joel's younger brother. It was brief and somewhat formal in the way of letters from someone who has been out of touch long enough to feel the distance, but it was warm underneath the formality, and it contained the information that Daniel and his wife were expecting their first child in the spring, which made Joel aware that he was going to be an uncle, and that time had moved forward for everyone while he had been trying to hold still inside it. He wrote back immediately, a longer letter than Daniel's, warmer, making up for lost years in pages. His mother wrote again in February, a longer letter this time, full of Missouri news and questions about Effie and the boarding house in Texas, and the specific kind of maternal warmth that travels better across distance than he had given it credit for. He read parts of it aloud to Effie over breakfast and watched her smile at his mother's observations, and thought about the fact that 2 women who had never met had managed, between them, to substantially reconstruct him. Spring came to Dry Creek in the way spring always came to that part of Texas, not gradually, but all at once, an overnight decision by the world to be warm and green again. The garden behind the boarding house that Effie tended in her early mornings came to life, and Joel found himself, to his own mild surprise, not only watching her work in it but occasionally working in it alongside her, learning which plants required what treatment and finding something meditative and deeply satisfying about the act of making things grow in the same piece of ground where you had put your own roots down. They had, in the winter months, been making changes to the boarding house, nothing drastic, but the gradual personal adjustments of a space that is beginning to reflect 2 people's lives rather than one. A shelf built in room 4, which was now their room by Joel's capable hands, to hold their combined small library. His copy of the worn book, which turned out to be a collected edition of Washington Irving's writings, on the shelf next to her Bible and her volume of Jane Austen. New curtains in the kitchen, because the old ones were genuinely decrepit and she had been meaning to replace them for a year and had not gotten to it alone. The coat hanging on its peg by the door, just a coat now, just outerwear, no longer a statement about anything except the weather. Marcus Hale, having redirected his commercial ambitions, had the early spring launched an attempt to buy the land on the north end of town where the old feed store had stood before it burned, and was building a new commercial venture with apparently no further interest in the boarding house. Dry Creek did not entirely trust him. It was a town with good memory, but his attention had moved on, and that was sufficient. In April, Effie told Joel, early in the morning before the house was awake, in the garden, while she was working and he was sitting on the back step with his coffee, that she was going to have a child. He set his coffee cup down very carefully and stood up, and she looked at him with the expression of a woman who has prepared for various possible responses, and he crossed the garden in 2 steps and took her face in both hands and kissed her, and she made a small sound against his mouth that was surprise and relief and happiness combined. "When?" he asked, against her forehead. "October," she said, "near as Dr. Hennessy can tell." He held her in the garden with the spring morning coming up around them, gold and green and warm, and felt the full and almost overwhelming reality of his own life. This life that had been, for 4 years, a series of roads and strangers and deliberately unset routes, now rooted so deeply in this place, and this woman that he could not imagine any direction of movement that was not toward her. "I need to write to my mother," he said. She laughed against his chest. "You need to write to your mother," she agreed. The summer of 1879 was one of the better summers that Dry Creek remembered. The cattle trade was active. There were 3 weddings in the county. The new school that the town had been debating for 2 years was finally funded, and construction began in June. And Effie Garner, now Effie Sheridan, ran her boarding house with her usual efficiency while growing visibly and cheerfully, refusing to slow down more than absolutely necessary, and accepting Joel's periodic insistence that she rest with the tolerance of a woman who understands that some battles are worth conceding. Joel had, by summer, moved from horse breaking and fence work to a position of more reliable employment. Beaumont Stokes had offered him a full-time job as foreman of the eastern operations of his ranch, which was an expansion of the role Joel had been gradually taking on anyway, and which paid a real wage and came with enough stability that the word future could be applied to it without irony. He had accepted with the calm of a man who has stopped being surprised by good things happening and started simply receiving them. He was good at the work in a way that went beyond the physical skills. He was good with the other hands, with the specific combination of directness and fairness that comes from a man who has been on the bottom end of situations and remembers what it is like to be treated as if your labor is all you are. The men who worked under him respected him and worked well, and Stokes trusted him, and this too was a kind of settlement, professional rootedness to go with the personal kind. August brought a letter that made Joel sit at the kitchen table for a long time without moving. It was from his father. His father, who wrote in the large, unpracticed hand of a man who works with his body more than a pen, told him that his mother was not well, a chest ailment that had come on with the spring and had not improved with the summer. The letter was not alarming exactly, but it was honest, the way Joel's father was always honest, and it said between its lines that she was not young and had not been truly strong since Thomas died, and that Joel's father, if Joel could visit, would be glad to see him. He brought the letter to Effie, who read it and then looked up at him. "You should go," she said. "You're 7 months along," he said. "I am entirely capable of managing for a few weeks," she said. "I have been managing this house for 3 years. Clara is here, Mr. Peabody is here, Dr. Hennessy is 50 yards away, and your mother needs to see you." He looked at her and then at the letter. "I don't want to leave you," he said. "I know," she said. "That is different from needing to leave. Your mother needs you to go. Come back before October and everything will be fine." He left in early September on Calico, with his saddlebag packed, and for the first time in years, the act of leaving was not an escape from anything but a journey with a destination and a return. He carried with him a daguerreotype of Effie that she had sat for at the photographer in Millard's Crossing at his insistence, and which he had carried in his breast pocket since the day he received it, next to the region of his chest that had, in 4 years of riding, slowly unnumbed itself into something warm and purposeful. The journey to Missouri took him 2 weeks by horse to the railhead in Kansas, and then 2 days by train, and he arrived in Springfield on a gray September morning to find his father at the station, older than memory, thinner, but upright with the particular pride of a man who was raised to stand straight under weight. His mother was ill but not dying. The truth of her condition was somewhere between what the letter had suggested and what Joel had feared, which was a relief that hit him with physical force. She was in bed a good part of the day, but her mind was sharp and her tongue sharper, and she held his face in both hands when he came into her room and said, "You look like yourself again," which was more eloquent than most things said to him in 4 years. He stayed 2 weeks in Missouri. He visited Thomas's grave, which he had not been able to do since the funeral, and stood there in the September grass and said the things he had not been able to say before, not aloud but in the internal voice of a man making peace with something permanent. He told his parents about Effie, about the boarding house, about the coming child, about Dry Creek and Beaumont Stokes's operation, and the way the West Texas country looked in every season. His mother listened with her eyes closed sometimes, saving her energy for the parts that made her smile, which were mostly the parts about Effie. "She sounds like the kind of woman who runs things," his mother said. "She does run things," Joel said. "She ran this entire situation without anyone being invited to help, and it ran beautifully." "Does she let you help?" "On her terms," he said. His mother opened her eyes and looked at him with the clear look that mothers have. "Good," she said. "That's how it should be." He left Missouri with the roads turning into the first colors of fall and arrived back in Dry Creek on the last day of September, dusty and trail-worn, and with a package under his arm that his mother had pressed on him. A quilt she had made herself, 22 years old, originally made for Thomas and never given, now pressed into Joel's, keeping with the words, "For the baby. It should go forward." Effie met him on the porch, rounder than he had left her, and he came up the porch steps and held her carefully and for a long time, aware of the new life between them. And the porch boards creaked under their weight, and the October light was golden, and everything was exactly where it should be. The child came on the 12th of October, 1879, which was a Sunday, with Dr. Hennessy in attendance and Mr. Peabody pacing the hallway downstairs with the anxiety of a grandfather by adoption. It was a boy, a fact that Joel received standing in the doorway of their room while Dr. Hennessy finished his work, a small, dark-haired, extremely vocal boy who announced himself to Dry Creek with the kind of lung capacity that suggested he had opinions about his arrival. Joel held his son for the first time and could not speak for a full minute, which was the longest silence of his adult life. "He looks like you," Effie said, from the bed, exhausted and clean-bright with happiness. "He looks like himself," Joel said, which was true. The boy had his own particular face, furious and brand new, entirely his own. And the idea of that, a whole new person, arrived into the world without precedent, was so profound and staggering that Joel had to sit down with him in the bedroom chair and simply hold him for a while. They named him Thomas Joel Sheridan, after the brother who had started everything by dying and the father who had learned, eventually, to come back to the living. Effie had suggested Thomas without being asked, which meant she had understood without his having to find the words for it, which was the thing he loved most about her, and one of very many things he loved about her. The winter of 1879 into 1880 was the warmest in recent memory, and the boarding house had never been more full, and the Sheridan household had never been noisier. Thomas Joel Sheridan was a child of considerable personality, cheerful when he was comfortable, extremely vocal when he was not, curious about everything within reach and several things beyond it. He had Effie's gray eyes and Joel's dark hair, and a disposition that was sui generis, recognizable as neither parent, simply himself. Mr. Peabody, who was 73 years old and had been largely indifferent to children for the entirety of his adult life, became wholly devoted to young Thomas in a way that surprised everyone, including himself, and could frequently be found on the porch with the boy in the afternoons, explaining the world with the patient thoroughness of a man who has been waiting for an audience that couldn't argue back. Clara, the laundry girl, had by now become something closer to a partner in the boarding house operation, taking on greater responsibility while Effie navigated the first months with Thomas. And Effie had adjusted her wages accordingly and treated her with the direct respect she gave to anyone who did good work. And the arrangement functioned well, and with the practical warmth that characterized everything Effie organized. Spring of 1880 brought Joel's parents west for a visit. His mother had recovered somewhat through the winter, not to her prior strength but enough to travel, and his father had taken the idea of meeting his grandson with the determined practicality of a man setting out to accomplish a thing. They stayed for 2 weeks in the boarding house, in the best room, and Joel's mother held Thomas on the porch in the April light and said nothing for a long time, and then said, "He has Thomas's forehead." Joel looked at her. "The first Thomas," she said gently, "the same line across the brow, the same wide look." He sat down beside her and they looked at the baby together. And the grief and the love and the continuation of things were all present in that moment, layered over each other the way sediment layers over old ground, making something new and thick and solid. His father and Effie had, within 24 hours of meeting, established a relationship based on mutual respect for practical capability, which was the highest form of regard either of them offered. His father fixed 3 things in the boarding house that Joel had not yet gotten to, and Effie fed him the best meals of his considerable life, and they were satisfied with each other in the solid, unspoken way of people who share a language made of work. When his parents left, his mother held Effie's hands at the station and said something to her quietly that Joel could not hear, and Effie listened with that full attention she brought to things that mattered and nodded, and his mother kissed her cheek. On the wagon home from the station, he asked, "What did she say to you?" Effie looked out at the spring country going by, green and vast. She said that she had been afraid after Thomas died that Joel would travel away from the grief until he traveled away from himself. She said she was grateful that I had been somewhere he could stop. He took her hand on the wagon seat. "You were not a destination I planned," he said. "I did not have you on any map." "No," she said. "The best things generally aren't." The summer of 1880 was the year the railroad came within 30 miles of Dry Creek, which changed the town the way the railroad changed everywhere quickly and thoroughly, and with a combination of benefit and loss that the town spent years sorting out. The cattle business shifted. New people came. Some old things were lost and others proved more durable than expected. Beaumont Stokes expanded his operation smartly, with Joel's planning assistance, and the boarding house had more business than ever, because new commerce meant new travelers and new travelers needed somewhere to sleep and be fed. Effie hired a second person, a cook named Robert who had been trained in San Antonio and who was very good, which freed Effie to manage the business side of things with greater attention, while still cooking the meals she wanted to cook and delegating the ones she didn't. She had a natural instinct for how to organize a thing, how to apportion work so that the right person was doing the right task, and nothing important was falling through the gaps, and watching her manage the expanded operation was something Joel found perpetually impressive and occasionally, privately, hilarious in the best way, because she had the kind of confidence in her own systems that was entirely justified and entirely without arrogance. In the fall of 1880, Effie was expecting again. This second pregnancy moved with the easier confidence of a known thing, and she was, if possible, more capable and less inconvenienced by it than she had been by the first, to the point where Dr. Hennessy told Joel privately that he thought she might actually be more efficient while pregnant than at other times, and that he said this as a medical observation rather than a judgment. The second child arrived in the spring of 1881, in April, and was a girl, a fact that Joel received with the same profound, wordless weight he had received Thomas, holding her in the bedroom chair and studying her small face as if it were a text in a language he was only just learning to read. They named her Margaret Ann Sheridan, after Effie's mother, who had died when Effie was 14, and who had been, by Effie's account, a woman of considerable warmth and particular stubbornness, and whose name deserved to be carried forward. Thomas, who was 18 months old and deeply unimpressed by the arrival of a rival for general attention, examined his sister with the scientific skepticism of a child confronting an unexpected variable, and then, after several days, appeared to decide she was acceptable. His acceptance was expressed by the placement of one of his toys, a small carved wooden horse that Beaumont Stokes had given him in the cradle beside her, which was, at 18 months, about as eloquent a gesture as anyone in the house had managed. Joel saw this happen and thought about the quilt, his mother's quilt that had originally been made for Thomas and now covered the children's cradles, carrying forward, as his mother had said, in the right direction. The coat still hung by the door. He put it on every morning when he left for work and took it off every evening when he came home, and it had been doing this faithful daily service for going on 3 years now, and it no longer meant anything except that it was a good coat, and the weather required it in winter, and the habit of hanging it up when you came indoors was the habit of a man who lived somewhere. The evening of Margaret's first month, when both children were asleep and the house was quiet and the spring evening had come down warm and scented through the windows, Joel and Effie sat on the porch in their usual chairs with their coffee, and the town was settling into its evening sounds, and the cottonwoods along the creek were leafed out full and silver in the last light. "I was thinking today," Joel said, "about the evening I drove into this town." "What about it?" "I was thinking about walking into the boarding house and you looking at me from behind the counter. You had that expression you have, the one where you're cataloging things. I was assessing whether you were likely to cause trouble," she said. "What was your conclusion?" She turned her coffee cup in her hands, considering. "That you were going to cause a different kind of trouble than the usual sort," she said. He laughed quietly. "What kind?" "The kind where I was going to have to actually think about things I'd been not thinking about for a while," she said. She was looking at the cottonwoods, her face in profile in the evening light, and she was 30 years old now and more herself than she had been at 25, if that was possible, settled into her own life the way a well-built house settles into its foundation, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen in 4 years of country that included some remarkable country. "I want to tell you something," he said. She looked at him. "I have been trying to find words for it. For what this is, this life, this," he gestured imprecisely at the house behind them, and the children sleeping inside and the town and the country around them. "I was a man with nothing. I mean, I had all the physical things, the horse, the coat, the wages, the road, but I had nothing. 4 years of nothing, and I had organized the nothing very efficiently so I didn't have to feel how much of a nothing it was. And then I walked into your house and had beans and went upstairs to room 4. She was watching him with absolute attention. "And now I have everything," he said. "I have everything. Thomas and Margaret and this house and this porch and your face across the table every morning. I have your voice in the next room while I'm working. I have your opinions, which I find I have become genuinely unable to do without. I have a place where when I come home and hang my coat up, the coat means something other than what it used to mean." He paused. "I don't know how to say it except that you saved my life without being asked to, and I think you should know that." Effie's eyes were bright in the evening light. She did not say anything for a moment, which was unusual for her, and the silence was not empty but full. "You saved your own life," she said finally. "You stopped when you found somewhere worth stopping. That was you. I stopped because of you. You stopped because you were ready to stop," she said. "I was just here, the right place at the right time. You were not just anything," he said. "Not minimize yourself to me." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she reached over and took his hand, the way she had across the kitchen table 2.5 years ago, and held it. "I was lonely," she said. "For a long time. I was very good at not letting it show, but I was. I ran this house and fed people, and it was a full life. But at the end of every day I sat in an empty kitchen, and it was quiet in the specific way that houses are quiet when no one is coming home to them. And then you came home to me. Every evening you kept coming home." "I will keep coming home," he said. She squeezed his hand. "I know," she said. The porch was quiet. In the house, a baby made a small sound and then went back to sleep, and somewhere down the street, the evening was full of the small sounds of a town living its life, and the cottonwoods stood in their full summer weight along the creek, silver and rustling and permanent. Joel Sheridan had not removed his coat indoors in 4 years. He had ridden from Missouri through Kansas and into Texas with the coat buttoned, and the message it sent. And he had walked through a boarding house door in July heat still wearing it, ready to leave before he had even arrived. And a woman named Effie Garner had asked him why, and he had told her the truth, and she had taken that truth and given him back a different question. Not why are you still wearing it, but what would have to be true for you to take it off, and in asking that question she had given him a direction he had not known he needed. The coat hung by the door. It went on in the morning and came off in the evening, and in between it did its proper work. And Joel Sheridan came home every day to a house that was worth coming home to a woman who was the truest person he had ever known, to children who were becoming themselves in all the particular glory of small children becoming themselves, to a porch and a kitchen and a garden and a town, and a piece of the wide West Texas country that was his, genuinely and permanently. In the only way that a place can truly be yours, because you chose it, because it cost you something to claim it, and because you are still choosing it every day that you hang your coat by the door and stay. The evenings continued. The coffee continued. The seasons moved over Dry Creek with their usual indifference to human failing and their usual provision of human beauty. Margaret grew into a child of strong will and strong appetite for everything the world offered her, and Thomas grew into a boy who asked serious questions about how things worked and remembered every answer. And Joel and Effie Sheridan grew into each other the way trees grow toward light, without deciding to, without being able to stop, toward the thing that sustains them. And in the years that followed, when the new school opened and when the railroad came closer, and when Dry Creek grew and changed, and when children grew and neighbors changed, and the country itself continued its enormous American becoming, there was always, at the end of every day, a coat being hung on a peg by the door, and a woman in the kitchen whose voice carried through the house, and a man coming home to both of them with the particular settled certainty of someone who has found what he was looking for and knows, without any need for further searching, that he has found it at last.